Are you looking to jump into Presonus Studio One and need a little bit of assistance in getting everything up and running? Well, today's video is going to be for you. We are going to break down Presonus Studio One, the installation process, and I've got some recommendations for as you're installing this software, what's going to help your computer run most efficiently for recording music at home. My name is Chris Green and my channel is all about practical tips and advice for guitar players. You may or may not be a guitar player. This video can still be for you as well. So if the content's interesting to you, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, because hey, why not? Studio One is the software, or the DAW, Digital Audio Workstation, that we use to record audio onto our computer. So in my previous video, I mentioned the problem that we have as guitar players is that we can't just plug our guitars straight into our MacBooks or our laptops. So what the software enables us to do is to use something such as an interface to plug our instruments or our microphones into this box that's also made by Presonus. Then the end of this box has a USB cable. That USB cable plugs in our computer. But that's not all. We need software, and the software is going to tell the computer what to do with all of this data. So here's some things that I'm recommending that you have with you, especially if you're going to be going along with me in this installation process. First thing, obviously, is your computer. What I'm using today in this video is a 13-inch MacBook Pro. This is one that has an i5 processor, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a 250 gigabyte hard drive. Now, I don't believe this is the solid state version, and we're gonna get to that in just a minute. But if you do happen to have a MacBook, this is one of the most entry-level MacBooks that you can get. It's got two USB-C ports on the side. It has one headphone jack on the other side. At the moment, all I have plugged in is the power supply, just to keep it up and running while we're recording here. And then also I have one of these USB hubs, okay? So this has a USB-C plug on one end, and what I'm using it for mostly is these USB type A ports. Now, if you have one of the Apple brand USB-C to USB type A adapters, that'll come in handy as well. Just know that whenever you're using a MacBook, you're gonna have a lot of these dongles. If you do decide to go Windows, a Windows laptop or a Windows PC, it's going to work fine as well. Presonus Studio One will work with Windows or Mac, and as we'll see when we get into installing, they will ask you, are you using a Mac or are you using a Windows? I've also got this solid state drive. This is an external solid state drive. This one is a Glyph drive. I believe this is a 500 gigabyte SSD. Now, why would I use an SSD? Whenever we're installing software, especially virtual instruments and things that are going to be used for recording, as much as possible, as many things as you can put on an SSD or an external drive, the better off you're going to be. Why is that? Even if I have an SSD or a solid state drive inside my MacBook Pro, you don't want to put all of your songs, your music, your virtual instruments, you don't want to install the software directly onto the same drive that your operating system is on. For one, I like to have all my songs on an external drive, because if I'm recording at home and I have this plugged into my computer, and then let's say we want to go record at our local church, well, I can actually just remove this solid state drive and I can take this with me in my backpack. I don't have to take my computer with me. I can just transport everything here. Also, your virtual instruments and things like pianos, synthesizers, virtual drums, those are going to weigh heavily on whatever drive you put them on. So a solid state drive is going to outperform a spinning hard disk drive. Also, an external drive or a secondary drive is going to outperform, most of the time, the same drive that's on your internal computer. So this MacBook Pro has a 250 gigabyte hard drive. I don't want to put anything unnecessary on that drive other than what my computer just needs to operate. The other thing I've got for today's video is the AudioBox 96. This is a USB 2-channel interface from Presonus. As I was mentioning earlier, this is the thing where you're going to plug in your microphone, or you're going to plug in your guitars or whatever you happen to be recording. It gives you 2 channels, so you can go one microphone here, one microphone here. You can do left and right. It's got gain knobs and all that sorts of stuff. And on the back, we have a USB cable. It's very much similar to the same USB cable you would use with a printer, okay? There'll be a separate video after this, once we get past all the installation, where we specifically talk about using your audio interface, and we'll start recording something together, okay? So make sure you hit the subscribe button. You won't miss out on that video. So now let's jump into the computer world. So if you did purchase a Presonus interface, I made a recommendation of this AudioBox 96. It's a USB interface. I believe you can get this thing way less than $100. And what's great about it is these interfaces from Presonus, they usually come with what's called Studio One Artist version. The Artist version is not going to have as much as their professional version of Studio One, but it's going to be plenty for what you need, especially if you're a singer-songwriter, if you're kind of a solo act, you're not recording too many pieces, and if you're not dependent on a lot of virtual instruments and virtual effects. If you're just trying to get down ideas for your song, can't recommend Studio One Artist version enough. So go ahead and open up your web browser. And where we want to head is called my.presonus.com. The first time you open up my.presonus.com, it's going to ask you to log in or create a new account. I'm not going to walk through the create an account process. Just hit pause on this video. It should be very simple. You're going to need an email address. You're going to create a password, and then you're going to put some other relevant information in for Presonus as well. Okay, they do have like a forums page if you're doing any support or anything on the community tab. Go ahead and create your Presonus account and log in. All right, now we're on the home page of my.presonus.com. As you can see, they're gonna have a lot of different articles, videos, and products. These things, if you need further help or understanding, you can jump in there as well. Now on the top right, we see this called Register a Product. If you happened to recently purchase an audio interface, at the bottom of your interface, there's going to be some necessary information. So when it says register a product, if you had a pamphlet that came with your interface as well for the software, or if you use the codes at the bottom of the interface, by registering your product, you're gonna unlock that software that came with your device. Now, assuming that you've had all of your stuff registered at this point, we're gonna go to what's called View Products. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you see under Software, we have Recording Software. Go ahead and click on that. All right, as you can see on the screen, I've been rolling deep with Presonus Studio One for quite some time. I'm not sponsored in this video at all. I just think it's a great product, but sometimes we need help with some of the installations, okay? So I'm gonna go over here to Studio One 5 Artist version. You probably have Studio One version 6. You may even have version 4. Whatever's gonna work with your computer. Now, just so you know, some of the stuff on the screen is gonna be blurred out or blacked out. We don't need to be sharing codes or anything. What I wanna do is obviously I wanna click where it says Download Installer Mac, okay? Now, if you're on a Windows, it probably says Windows instead. Now, this installation file is very small, and all it's going to be doing is giving us a prompt for the future installations. Now, that should be somewhere most likely in your Downloads folder, so let's go ahead and open that up. All right, once you've double-clicked on the file that we just downloaded, let's do what it says. Let's drag Studio One 5, or whatever version you have, to the Applications folder and drop it. Now that we moved it into our Applications folder, if you're on a Mac, open up Applications and let's run Studio One. Now Studio One has scanned my computer and got things up and running for us, and this is the main screen I want us to look at in today's video, Studio One installation, because believe it or not, the main chunk of what we're using, some of the features and things that you're going to want to have on your computer have not been downloaded yet. This process can take a lot longer than the initial installation, and we're going to go through that right now. So where it says install from, the account that you created at my.presonus.com, that's the account that's linked to all your purchases from the My Presonus store. So if you get any of their products, any of their extra plugins, any of their extra virtual instruments, it's linked to that account that you created. If you're purchasing products from Sweetwater or any sort of other music store. They should be sending you emails with product codes. And again, you need to register those on your Presonus account to make sure they show up, okay? Now, where it says install to, this is an important one. I'm gonna go to what's called select, and this is the part where we need to plug in our dongle with our external drive. You may not need a dongle if you've got the ports for it, but this SSD runs off of USB 3.0, and I'm gonna plug it into this dongle so that it will show up on my computer. All right, so now you can see from the screen here, I have my SSD. My SSD, I've titled it Songs SSD. So when I plug this SSD into a computer, I know that my music, my recording stuff is on that. I highly recommend that you rename your external solid state drives so that way you have a way of separating what's what. I'm gonna locate the root folder of my SSD on the side here, and I'm gonna click this new folder button, and I'm gonna create a folder called my main Presonus hub. Call it whatever you want. Basically, I just want to have one folder, and inside that folder there can be many other folders, but all this content is related to virtual instruments, things that I'm installing from Presonus. I want to make sure that these things don't get deleted, so that's my main Presonus hub. And I'm going to select that folder. So everything I'm installing from Presonus, everything that's going to download, virtual instruments, plugins, whatever, they're going to be headed towards my main Presonus hub. Install to, make sure you've got your folder on your SSD selected, and then configuration. This is the big chunk of this video here today. You can go to full installation if you want to. That's saying that it's going to take up 103 gigabytes of my 500 gigabyte SSD. I rarely ever want to do full installation. First folder labeled instruments. Now, even if you're running the professional version of Studio One, this folder labeled artist instrument library, I'm gonna recommend you go ahead and download this library. Why is that? Inside your artist instrument library, there's gonna be a lot of basic things that you may find useful in the future. You're gonna get some sort of piano, an organ, some synthesizers, a few drum beats, their versions of strings or orchestral items. They're just giving you a spattering of the different virtual instruments available. Now, if you're working on a podcast or a video and you're just wanting to add a little bit of drums or 6 seconds worth of audio, if you have the artist library installed, it's only going to take up about 1.5 gigabytes of space, but that 1.5 gigabytes gives you the most basic form of all these different instruments, and you're going to be glad that you have it. Okay, so the artist instrument library, I'm going to recommend you download that. Presence XT Core library. This is where you can get a little bit more specific. If you know that you're not going to need wind instruments, if you know that you're not going to need strings at all, we'll go through and customize which ones you want, okay? The acoustic guitars, I'm probably going to stay away from virtual instruments involving guitars. I have a lot of guitars. If you're a guitar player, you're probably not going to like the sound of virtual guitars. So this is something that, despite the advances in technology, if you've ever heard a virtual rendition of what an acoustic guitar is, like on a keyboard, it sounds like a virtual rendition of it for the most part. They're getting better, but basses is a good one. Okay, this is not just like an upright bass, but it'd also be a bass that sounds similar to like a synth bass as well. That's a fun one to have. I'm not usually using brass at all. I'm not using the electric guitars. Keyboards is good. That's going to include things like a Rhodes or some sort of Wurlitzer. Mallets, I guess if you want to have mallets, that's fine. Percussion and vocals is fun. I'm going to download that. And strings. Everybody could use a few strings every now and then. So as you can see, just go through this folder, Presence XT Core Library. That's just their name of their virtual instrument, Presence XT Core. Impact Kits and Sounds. Go ahead and I'm gonna check this one off. It's almost 2 gigabytes, but anything that you want as far as like kick drums and clap sounds or I don't want to say fake sounding drums, but electronic drums. So if you're into making beats, or you want to have a little bit of samples to use to supplement your acoustic drums, Impact kits, okay? Impact is going to, on Presonus, it's going to look very similar to one of those touchpad controllers that you see with like Ableton or Novation. Presence looks more like a keyboard, so all your keyboard sounds, anything that you play on a piano keyboard, you're going to do with Presence. Impact is their drum sampler, okay? Loop libraries, this is an interesting one. So if you want to check off loop libraries, that would be fine. The loops that they have can be used for things like if you're doing a podcast, like I was mentioning, you just want 10 seconds of audio, you don't want to spend a lot of time creating a new song, you just rather use some loops that are already pre-made. Go ahead and download the loop libraries. Impulse responses. Now most of the time when I'm thinking impulse responses, I'm thinking of things like the Strymon Iridium or things that are trying to replicate real life. So that could be related to the reverb in Studio One. I'm not sure. I don't know if I've ever downloaded the impulse responses, but let's just download it anyway. Documentation is something that you probably don't want to bother downloading. That's going to be like the manual for the software, and who's got time to read all of that. Legacy and compatibility. I think that the Studio One piano is worth a download for sure. Some of these other things I don't have as much experience with. Vintage keys could be an interesting one. It's totally up to you. I think having a piano, as far as virtual instruments go, having different pianos is never going to be a bad thing. You're usually not looking at a folder of 50 different acoustic pianos and thinking to yourself, oh, this is way too many. They usually all have their own unique sound, and it's worth giving it a listen. Now, Studio One demos and tutorials, again, if you use YouTube or if you'll go to my.presonus.com, there's plenty of tutorials and videos on there as well. Don't bother downloading them for your SSD. We want to reserve some space. Okay, Celemony Melodyne Essential. We've actually, as far as pitch correction goes, Melodyne early on, I'm not sure if this is the same way anymore, but Melodyne came paired with even the artist version of Studio One. We love it so much that even with instruments and stuff, you can go through. I've got a bass guitar, and if you're doing single note stuff, like especially on a bass, or if you've got a vocal and you just need to nudge a few of the notes back into place, it's a great thing to have. I almost always tune my bass after I tune it before I play, but I also tune my bass with Melodyne because I play an Austin P bass. I got this bass at a pawn shop. The intonation is not great, but I'll play it as much as I can, and then I can go through, and if I hear something egregious, I can bump it into place with Melodyne. Then you have this folder for my purchased items. If you've got anything like the loops, these are all in, it looks like a lot of stuff, but usually this stuff came in a pack. And I'll tell you this, the one that came early, the soft tube saturation knob, that one's pretty fantastic. The VU meter is also really good. I like using that as well. Much of these other things, Ampire is pretty interesting. So if you're a Line 6 Helix user, if you use a lot of software with your guitar playing and stuff, check out Ampire. Okay, it's gonna have things like chorus pedals, overdrive pedals, different amp simulations, and you can turn these things on and off. So you may have a guitar sound and you're wanting to add a delay to it. Well, you can go through on Ampire and you can turn off every effect, turn off the amp sim and everything, and just use the delay pedal simulation. Okay, you don't have to go all in. Sometimes when you load something like Ampire, when these companies create virtual guitar stuff, unless they're Line 6 or Kemper, sometimes it can sound a little fake, but if you go through and customize it, take the time to tailor your sound, Ampire can sound great, okay? MVP loops and some other stuff as well. Now, what I've checked off when we've gone through this whole thing is got us down to 22 gigabytes. 22 gigabytes is a whole lot better on our 500 gigabyte SSD than 100. But again, if you want to do a full installation, go ahead. All right, from this point, you're gonna hit install, and here's what's gonna happen. Your internet connection is gonna determine how quickly all this stuff downloads. But the good news is it will work in the background. As long as you have Studio One running somewhere, you can minimize this screen. You can actually start recording if you want to, and just let this thing download, okay? My internet is not crazy fast, but maybe within an hour or two, it'll get 22 gigabytes downloaded. A couple more things we want to do before we call it a day here. I'm going to take my USB interface and plug it in. This is not the first time I've plugged it in, so it may go ahead and recognize it here. There it is. Okay, in the middle of the screen, as you can see here, it pulled up Audio Box USB 96. If I click right here, it's going to bring up this screen under Audio Setup. Where it says Playback Device, make sure this tab for audio devices is selected. Make sure your playback device is set to Audio Box 96 or whatever your interface is, and not MacBook Pro speakers. The great thing about Studio One is that if you are using a Presonus interface, Studio One should recognize the interface right away. Okay, so we want to make sure our recording device is set to Audio Box. We want to make sure our playback device is set to Audio Box as well. While you're here, this device block size, set it at 256 for now, and maybe even bump it up to 512. We'll talk about block size, and we'll get into recording with the interface in a future video. As I mentioned, just wanted to cover that. Make sure you got your interface synced up as well. Now on this Preferences tab, we want to go from Audio Setup over to Locations. Now by default, Presonus Studio One will save everything to your My Documents folder on your laptop. Now where am I going to want to change that? Of course I'm going to want to go over here, click these three dots. I'm going to navigate to my Songs SSD. I'm going to find my main Presonus hub. As you can see, there's now a folder called Sound Sets. That's the stuff that's downloading in the background. On my main Presonus hub, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it Studio One Song Files. Call it whatever you want, but this folder in particular is where all of my sessions are going to be saved. So I'm going to hit Open. And now under Locations, User Data, the user data location for your songs, projects, shows, presets, and etc. is going to be saved on my SSD. And then I'm going to hit the OK button. Now, important thing to remember, and this is probably the biggest downside when you are using an external SSD. Anytime you're about to open up Studio One, before you open up the software, you need to make sure that you've got your SSD plugged in, because Studio One is going to be looking for all that stuff that we saved on our SSD. So take the time, make sure your SSD is plugged in first, then open up Studio One. Now from there, you can click New Song. It'll bring up a little window screen. And as you can see, under the name of the song title, we have Volume Songs SSD, and we have our folder location automatically pulled up for our songs SSD. Okay, so now anytime you create a new song, by default, it's going to be saving everything to our SSD for us. Things are going to run a lot faster. You're going to notice that the weight being put on your computer is not going to be near as much as if you put it all on the internal drive. But there you have it. If you're new to Studio One, this should get you up and running with all the installations. Again, oh, looks like my internet failed me on the downloads, so I'll have to make sure I download that later, maybe turn off some of these other devices. But as far as installing Studio One goes, this has been your initial launch point. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, because in the next video, what we're gonna do is open up our first song, and we're gonna start recording something with our Audio Box 96. I'm gonna show you some of the settings and how to get a good level going into your interface. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, hit the like button, and we'll see you in the next video.